Doc, with all the busy work that you're doing, thank you so much for joining us. Gentlemen, can you give us an overview of the sanctions that were imposed to Zimbabwe by the US, and which ones were removed, and what does this mean for our country right now?
Thank you so much. Well, the very first set of sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe were actually unofficial sanctions in September of 1999, when Zimbabwe was actually had the Europeans and the Americans unhappy with the donor conference that had happened in Harare not being successful to stop land reform. They decided to deny Zimbabwe loans from the IDA, International Development Association, together with the IMF. And then in 2000, they then asked for the IMF, the World Bank, to also cut them off. And all this was done so that they could try and influence the Zimbabwean people to vote no in the referendum that was coming up, and to also not vote for ZANU-PF in the parliamentary elections that were coming that year. And so when Zimbabweans decided that they were still going to vote for ZANU-PF and ZANU-PF won, then there was officially a policy by the Congress of the United States to actually input ZIDERA, which did exactly what these former unofficial sanctions did, to deny the Zimbabwean government access to multilateral loans, and more importantly, the cancellation of debts that were usually colonial debts that had been brought into the new Zimbabwe. And when that was done, it was intended this time to ensure that the next election, 2002, would remove Robert Mugabe from power so that they can reverse land reform. And when that failed, that's when they felt that the ZIDERA, this denial of multilateral lending loans, was not working, so they decided to input executive order sanctions in 2003. Now, what is important about these executive order sanctions is Zimbabwe was declared an unequivocal and extraordinary threat to the United States of America. That meant that Zimbabwe was a threat to the American interest and security, and so it became a country that they had to neutralize with two options, either war or economic weapons. They chose to go for economic weapons, called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. But if the International Emergency Economic Powers Act didn't work, the President of the United States would simply go back and declare another national emergency that would enable him to put boots on the ground. And that's what a lot of Zimbabweans don't understand, is that what we were under are under war and defense sanctions. They actually stipulated as Title 50 war and defense sanctions. That's how serious they are. And they were meant to target the engine of the economy of Zimbabwe, because they realized that just taking away multilateral loans was not working, so they now had to target the industry. They had to target the parastatals. They had to target government. They had to target government, local government, municipalities, and anyone who does business with them, which is the entire Zimbabwean community. So they were trying to stop them from offering Zimbabwean civilians services. They were trying to stop the government, its parastatals, and the businesses from creating jobs, from providing healthcare, education, water, food. Hence, our fight against these sanctions in the legal realm and in the multilateral realm was that these were crimes against humanity, because when you target civilians, collectively punish them and persecute them, that is a crime against humanity.
Now, speaking in terms of international relations, we've seen that there are various groups that are formed, such as BRICS, the Sahel region, and different, I think, an African consciousness seems to be spreading across the continent. And as a result, each country has its ego. Rutendo, can we safely say that America's ego is not allowing it to completely just go away with all sanctions, and they have to do this phase by phase? Because it seems like the pressure groups such as yourselves and many others from various parts of the world seem to have made a headway. Is it an ego thing to say we can't completely be seen to have lost a grip on this matter, and we're doing it in phases?
I think the issue of the 11 sanctions placed on the individuals was just a way of the Americans saving face after they'd done something very brave, honestly speaking. It's brave because they were able to reverse a crime against humanity and a violation of human rights that they were undertaking, and an illegality they were undertaking. They listened to what the UN said, they listened to what our case was saying in the South African courts, they realized they were wrong, and they capitulated. But remember, they're a superpower, an economic superpower, military superpower, forced to capitulate by the pressure of civil society and African governments. That is not easy for a superpower to take. Hence, they had to now have a token of sanctions that seemed to feed into their narrative that we punish people who violate human rights. But look at it this way. There's a billionaires there, Sandra Mpunga. There is Obey Chimuka. There is Kudata Gure. These are business people. They're not involved in government. They're not in the army. They're not in the police. How could they have violated the human rights of Zimbabweans? And where did the corruption take place? And where was it proved? And where was it tried in a court of law for the Americans to be collectively punishing them for something that they are alleging? And they keep saying in their own press conferences, they are allegedly committing corruption.
Like the recently
allegedly, the president of Zimbabwe is facilitating gold trading and diamond trading. There is allegations. We don't punish people on allegations, and this is not the law that we've made in Zimbabwe. It is universal human rights law and the Bill of Human Rights created by the very same Americans who say that people cannot be punished without trial. People must have an opportunity to answer to allegations that are set against them. So quite frankly, I think America is saving face. They know that if the 11 people were to go and petition the American government legally or even through the courts to remove them from those sanctions because they're unjustified in punishment without trial, those sanctions will be removed. And I have spoken to some of the people on that list, and initially when they were on the executive order sanctions listed as individuals, they said, we're not interested in being removed from these lists as individuals. We are more interested in the Zimbabwean people being removed from these lists, and then we can then fight for ourselves. And I think this is the time that we've reached now, that these individuals can now have a very good law firm, and I have a number of brilliant international lawyers who know how to deal with this, plus Simba Chitando, who was on this case. They will know how to simply write a letter to the OFEC and the President of the United States, petitioning them to do what they did with the removal of sanctions on innocent civilians, to remove sanctions on innocent people who have never been taken to court.
Doc, he's given us the full background of these sanctions, and what does this mean with the ones that have been removed? Have they already implemented this, and where are we right now?
Okay, first I think he explained about the two sets of sanctions, right? We had ZIDERA on one hand, which deals with issues of multilateral financial institutions and so forth, and then we had the executive orders, which dealt with certain individuals and certain companies, which was then rescinded, the decision which was rescinded recently. And we saw that they removed many companies that were listed or targeted under these executive orders. We had the former president, his wife, and other people, and so also other companies that were listed, which were removed. And unfortunately, they also decided now to put our president on the sanction list, the president, the first lady, and the vice president, and other, individuals, and some 3 companies, I think, which is quite unfortunate, that because we were not expecting that. We have been saying, I'm sure, as they will also been arguing, that these sanctions to begin with are unjustified and they are illegal and therefore must be removed. So the idea is we need to have sanctions completely removed on Zimbabwe. Whether ZIDERA was used or was never used, but still these sanctions must be removed. There is no justification whatsoever to have the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe under sanctions, because their argument is there is human rights violations in Zimbabwe, there is corruption in Zimbabwe, and therefore that's why we are aiding the president. But you and I could actually see that when you look at the global politics, we can tell where there is real human rights violations. I think the case between South Africa and Israel presented actually a good case study of human rights violations. But the Americans did not raise a hand over those particular issues, but they continue to target countries such as Zimbabwe. Of course, this, we can't celebrate, the removal of these people. Why? Because it was not justified to begin with. And therefore, there was no need whatsoever to have Zimbabwe put on the sanctions. But of course, we also have to acknowledge the work that they have been doing, putting pressure, and together with even SADC, we had the SADC anti-sanction day campaign. We have also a number of African leaders who have spoken against the sanctions. So we are saying collectively, they've also done a good job to pressurize the Americans so that they remove the sanctions. So we want them to continue again so that sanctions are completely removed.
So, Doc, I wanted to ask you, after what Rutinde said, he's mentioned that America still has the power to reverse certain decisions and all of that. Does the U.S. government have a hidden agenda, or the powers that be have a hidden agenda towards all of this?
Okay, before I answer that, I think I just need to add to some of the things that he has actually said. In terms of the impact, your question on how does it affect you and me as ordinary people. So as we have said in the beginning, there were two sets of sanctions. One was Zidera and the other one was the executive orders. If you look at the Zidera, if in the event that the USA government is to invoke Zidera, it means it would also have an impact on you and me. Of course, they haven't invoked it as of now, but we are saying in the event that they are to invoke that particular act, it would actually have an impact. And another aspect is the fact that you have the president of the country under sanctions. It's in a way restrictive, because we are saying the president is the chief negotiator, he is the chief diplomat of the country, he is the person who represents the interest of Zimbabwe. Of course, we have other people who could be sent on his behalf, but we are saying the fact that the president of Zimbabwe cannot freely go to America to negotiate with Biden or even to lure investors to come into Zimbabwe is actually a challenging aspect. That is why we're saying they also have to be completely removed, because that particular restriction is unjustified and it has also an impact on us in terms of the coming in. And the fact that you have a country that is listed under sanctions would also have an impact, because there are certain people who will be resisting to come into a country where they know their leaders are under sanctions and there have been accusations of human rights violations, lack of respect for property rights and so forth. I'm saying these were the allegations which they have been putting. So we are saying when you have your country put under that particular narrative, it also have an impact in terms of the number of people who will be coming to your country to make investment. And then going now to your question, do they have a hidden agenda? Of course they do have a hidden agenda, because we go back to what he talked about, the reasons why we had sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe to begin with. It was the issue of the land reform program. They wanted it to be reversed, and they've also seen that the Americans have interfered in domestic affairs of a number of countries using different tools
within Africa.
And yes, even outside of Africa. And in some areas they've actually used force, and in some areas they've used sanctions. In our case, where they've tried to employ the use of sanctions as a way of trying to interfere with our domestic affairs. The same way perhaps they are trying to do with South Africa, where they are trying to push South Africa to take a different position in regards to Israel through the threats or the use of sanctions. So we are saying they are trying to change or to force African countries to change policies, right, to shift their policies and perhaps put policies that favors the interest of the Americans and their allies through the use of different instruments such as sanctions. So that is why we have been saying that sanctions have to be removed.
And lastly, before I let you gentlemen go, the largest U.S. embassy in Africa is residing right here in Zimbabwe, in Westgate. And this is a big decision that most of us did not expect to happen right now. Is this the beginning of a new season of American diplomacy with African nations, starting with Zimbabwe, going to the rest of Africa, or what is coming up next?
Your answer is a two-pronged question, and it deals with the question that you asked, do they have an agenda? Yes, America has an agenda, but this time the agenda is not focused on Zimbabwe anymore. Zimbabwe has done its land reform, it's done. Zimbabwe has done its indigenization, it's done. They've realized that they can't reverse it. But they've got the threat that South Africa is about to undertake land reform and about to radically economically transform that economy. So there's also a risk of Namibia doing the same thing. That's where America's focus is now, not Zimbabwe. And what they're willing to do now is to remove sanctions on Zimbabwe. And like we said, they won't remove all of them because they will lose face. That's why they've maintained some. The issue of Zidera is not going to be effective. It's not sanctions on the whole country. And the directors of the United States can be directed by the president, who was one of the sponsors of Zidera, not to vote against Zimbabwe getting loans. So that can be nullified, it can be muted. Magnitsky Act, we understand that it's not being implemented as yet. They're saying if those people make violations that can be proved to be corruption or violation of human rights, then they will kick it in and stop the traveling. So my understanding is that the president will be able to travel, according to what the spokesperson said. They'll be able to do their business unless something happens that then forces the Americans to implement, right? So there's still need for clarity on that in practical terms. So I believe that right now America is not focused on Zimbabwe anymore. It's trying to win Zimbabwe over. Because if it sanctions South Africa, when Zimbabwe is also under sanctions, then they have no ally in Southern Africa. They lose Southern Africa. They radicalize Southern Africa, and they unite Southern Africa with South Africa's plight. So they want now to liberate Zimbabwe, try and push Zimbabwe to be more Western focused, and then isolate South Africa, which is being seen to align itself with Russia, China, and the East. And this is where we're saying that as Zimbabweans now, we've got to play this smart. Even though we are desperate for investment, let's not isolate South Africa, and let's not align with people who we know are parasitic and can only survive by exploiting us and not having mutually beneficial relationships. So let's take what they give us, but let's not realign with them 100%. Let's continue to be non-aligned, but with a bias towards the East. And when South Africa goes under sanctions, we need to stand with them. The biggest mistake we can make is to align with the West, become enemies with South Africa, and then we align with Zambia here, and then AFRICOM comes onto the continent, and then still we remain as vassals because all they want is our resources and to exploit our resources. So we need to play smart. And that's what I think the current agenda is, to win over Zimbabwe, make it the hub of Southern Africa, make Zimbabweans angered by what South Africans did when the xenophobia and anti-Zimbabwean sentiment started. They want Zimbabweans to use that sentiment to determine a policy that will make us align with the West against South Africa and the region. That would be a mistake, and we need to be smart, strategic. And another thing, when South African white investment, when Western investment comes to Zimbabwe, we need to make sure we've got policies to ensure that they don't do what they did in South Africa, where they dominate the economy and they begin to dictate our policies, our government policies, laws. We cannot have that situation, because we would reverse ourselves back into the pre-sanctions era, and then when sanctions can be imposed on us again by over-dependency on Western capital, and we need to make sure we don't put ourselves in that position.
Gentlemen, it seems like this is just the beginning of very interesting times in terms of international relations, foreign and local policy, and the economics attached to it, and lawmakers and those that are specialists in terms of international trade, international relations, are probably on their chessboards like you have, and you've given us a great playbook. I hope that those that are at power will also be listening to your recommendations. This has been Focus 54. I believe that Chance may crown as king will be able to have a follow-up of this wonderful discussion. We glad to have the chairperson of the Zimbabwe Anti Sanctions movement, and to have you, Dr. Chakanyuka, coming through as our political analyst. This has been Focus 54. Unfortunately, time is not on our side, and we'll have to leave.